I'd like to welcome everyone to our event this evening, exploring the impact of decentralized clinical trials. We're so happy that you've chosen to spend some time with us tonight and learn about this topic. My name is Chelsey Ryan. I'm the Director of Clinical Operations and Pharmacovigilance with PROMETRIKA, and I'm here with my fellow Brandeis alum, Ken Getz, from the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development. We are so happy and honored that Ken has joined us for this event, and really looking forward to sharing with you all our thoughts about decentralized clinical trials and when it is appropriate to use it, as well as when it might not be the best times to use those tools. Before we get into that, I would like to just give you an overview about PROMETRIKA. We are a privately owned full-service CRO. We focus on quality and flexibility. We were founded by Dr. Meganish Stepanians in 2003, and we were founded with a starting 18 key team members. In 2007, we expanded our services to include clinical operations, monitoring, safety services, and then we've really grown from there. So in 2010 through 2012, we expanded our partnerships. We started to work with metadata, CDISC, certifications, SCDM, and then we also became a women-owned business, a certified women's-owned business, which we are very proud of. And in those partnerships and collaborations, we really started to learn more about technology, how to incorporate technology to do the very best for our sponsors. 2016, we expanded and we moved to our headquarters in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where we still are today. And today, we are a staff of 85. We've run hundreds of clinical trials, phase 1 through 4, and we have proudly been included in 21 NDA and BLA submissions. With that, I will let Ken introduce himself.
Great. Thank you so much, Chelsey. And I just want to say what a pleasure to be here this evening. I'm really looking forward to our discussion, and hopefully you'll participate as well. And I want to thank PROMETRIKA for the wonderful opportunity to be here. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Tufts Center. We're across the river, part of the Tufts University School of Medicine. We're an academic think tank, and we gather empirical evidence about the drug development enterprise. So we do a lot of studies on the cost of drug development, the success of individual programs by therapeutic area, and failure rates to really understand where in development we are seeing challenges in the introduction of new therapies. And we do a lot of research that looks at practices and solutions and new approaches and their impact on drug development performance. We're about 50 years old, hard to believe, and started with really a focus on regulatory reform and how that impacts drug development and the introduction of new innovations. But we've really grown in our focus dramatically. And often our research is used to inform Congress. We've testified before Congress. The FDA funds a number of our studies. We do a lot of work with the NIH and the Department of Defense, and certainly the private sector, which is one of the primary areas that we look at. So again, delighted to be here, and I'm going to have a chance to share some of the results of our empirical studies to frame a lot of our discussion and guide our discussion as well. So Chelsey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Before we get going, we just want to make sure that we're all talking the same language and give some definitions around what we mean by decentralized clinical trials. The industry has some different meanings. Typically speaking, it's virtual or hybrid. When you're taking the trial and you're in a virtual setting, you're taking the patient outside of the site and bringing the trial to their home or wherever they are located. And then in a hybrid setting, you're still having them come on site for some things, and you're also including some of that element of having them be in their own home setting. Different tools are available for DCT. We have telemedicine, e-consent, wearable devices, home visits, direct IP shipments, and decentralized monitoring. And what we really want to talk about is DCT has become pretty popular, but it's been around for a while. We've been doing virtual trials, we've been doing hybrid trials for many years. One of the very first fully virtual trials was done by Pfizer in 2011. We also see virtual trials coming up regularly for real-world evidence, registry studies. These type of studies are really well fit for a fully virtual trial. And then there's a range, right? So we have fully traditional trials where you need to be on site because the trial requires that. The protocol requires you to be on site. And then there's that bigger chunk in the middle where it's hybrid. There's some elements that are on site. There's some elements that are at the patient's home. And we'd like to talk about how not one size fits all. It's not something to think, I'm a sponsor and I want to do DCT and I want to do virtual trials because that's what everybody's doing. We really want to have a candid discussion where sometimes maybe you shouldn't do DCT, and that's totally fine. But at the end of the day, the protocol is really what should be driving your decisions. It shouldn't be because you want to try a new technology. It should be because it's fit for purpose and the quality for the patient is there. So our agenda tonight is a fun one. We are going to be talking a lot about data. We have Ken here. We'll be talking about the drug development trends in our industry. We'll also be talking about how the pandemic really made us do things that maybe some of us as sponsors and CROs weren't comfortable with doing at that time. We had to jump into DCT. We were forced to do virtual trials and what that meant. Now that things have kind of slowed down, let's reflect and think, should we have done DCT things in those trials? What did we learn from that experience? How can we make more thoughtful, or maybe just have more time to think about the decision now? And then when you're looking at your protocol, what are some of those considerations, the DCT considerations during protocol development? And then lastly, we're going to go into future considerations. So we've been through not the whole thing, but we're getting through the pandemic together, but now we can take a moment to sit back and think about the future and where we want to go. I'll hand it back to Ken.
Great. So we're going to begin each section of the agenda with a question that we'll pose, and that will help frame our thinking as we move through the topic. So the first question, what major drug development trends characterize the environment into which new solutions are being adopted and integrated? And why are we asking this question? In part because this happens infrequently, but in those situations where a particular solution really catches our interest, there's a level of exuberance, in some ways even an irrational desire to adopt and try out a new solution. But at the end of the day, we still have to ask, what are the underlying conditions that will likely not change as a result of using this solution broadly? What are some of the underlying conditions into which we have to consider and evaluate when a solution is indicated and when it may not be? So we're going to start first with a very macro level view, and then we'll get ever more granular as we look at our protocol design behaviors. So if you'll indulge me for a minute, we're going to take a giant step back and start with just some very macro level trends that tell such a fascinating story about our enterprise today. At the far left of the table, we're looking at the total amount that's spent on R&D globally each year. And we've now exceeded about $160 billion, which is rising at roughly the rate of 6 to 7% annually. The next column looks at a measure of productivity or output. And we're now seeing in 2020, 21, and 22 the highest number of biologics and NDAs or drug approvals in our history. It's one of the highest levels, and it's been sustained at this level. That's encouraging news given the growth in spending. But as you start to move out on this table, you see some of the other, perhaps more concerning insights here. If you look at the average peak sales that will be generated from every new drug or biologic introduced into the marketplace, they're now at roughly half the level today that we saw in that 2005 period. And they seem to continue to decline, in large part because we're focusing on smaller markets. We're focusing on smaller and more narrowly defined patient communities, and I'll talk about that further. For the bean counters, for corporate and strategic planners, there's always a look at the return on development investment, and that return has been steadily declining, where now it's at a third of the level that we saw in that 2005 period. So this begins to tee up some of the challenges that we know organizations are focusing on, and those are really captured here as well. There's more of a race to bring drugs into the marketplace. In order to offset the loss in the potential revenue that can be generated by a single product, we see many of the large and mid-sized companies looking to fill the commercial side with even more candidates that are now generating revenue, and they're looking to secure approval for multiple indications for the same drug, as just an example of some of the strategies that are being pursued. That implies and suggests that there's even more of a premium placed on cycle time acceleration. Here in this chart, I'm showing you on the left-hand side growth in the number of drugs that are in clinical testing, and it now exceeds 6,000, with the largest or most dominant segment being in oncology. But you see that overall it's a very, very robust innovation engine today, growing at about 9 to 10% each year. On the right-hand table, you see another very interesting characteristic of this landscape, and that is the proliferation of smaller companies, many that are literally developing a single molecule or candidate. We now see as a segment, small emerging biotech and small pharma is the dominant segment sponsoring a lot of this clinical trial activity. This is a segment that in many cases is relying on the capital markets to support their development activity. So there may be more risk involved, especially in their reliance on that capital if they don't have a drug already generating revenue in the marketplace. And this is a group that has an even higher reliance on contract service providers to really offer the capacity and expertise that's needed. So let's go a little bit more into some unique characteristics of our pipeline. Today, we see our pipelines dominated by personalized or stratified medicine that's really targeting a very, very specific or narrowly defined patient community. There is a very high reliance on genetic information now. 100% of all oncologics now rely on a genetic material and information to target patient communities or the right patient subgroup. And we see the use of a growing number of molecules that are relying on biomarker data as well. We also know that it's a landscape and a pipeline that is dominated by ever-increasing numbers of molecules targeting rare diseases. And so this really helps give us a flavor for the types of markets that these products will ultimately be introduced into. And it starts to reflect some of the challenges that we face within these unique patient subpopulations. And that's really captured on this particular slide. Now we're looking at the very, very granular protocol level. At the Tufts Center, we monitor and gather data to update benchmarks on protocol design practices roughly every 3 years, and we've been doing this for over 20 years. Here what I'm showing you are comparisons between those protocols targeting non-oncology related illnesses and oncology specifically, and then on the far right-hand side we look at protocols that target rare diseases versus all others that fall into the non-rare category. A couple of key areas to call out. First, both in oncology and in rare diseases, we see protocols that tend to be much more focused. They tend to have fewer endpoints, and more of the procedures that are performed are to gather data that will inform or support primary or key secondary endpoints. But we also see generally a higher number of countries, and we see, as you would expect, a lower number of patients enrolled per site, which really underscores how difficult recruitment and retention is among these patient populations in very, very targeted or stratified patient subpopulations. One other area, or two other areas I'll call out. If you look at the treatment duration line, especially in oncology. You see just how long these studies are today, and that's in part because they include a long or an extended long-term follow-up period. And for all of our protocols, we're collecting a remarkable amount of data, over 2.5 million data points on average for our oncology and non-oncology protocols. We've seen some protocols in our studies that are, and this is for a single protocol, and I'm looking at phase 2 and 3 trials combined. For the typical pivotal trial, we're looking at 3.5 to 4 million data points for the protocol. So remarkable volume of data, and a lot of it coming in from multiple primary data sources. So that's just a backdrop for you, and part of the point that we're trying to make here is that the introduction of new solutions will need to address a lot of these underlying conditions, or we will question and we will reevaluate when and if they should be utilized. And that's really where we come now to DCT practices and our question to frame our thinking. Has the pandemic engendered broad, sustainable adoption and new practices, or is further evaluation, as Chelsey mentioned, really indicated here and necessary? And I think you can already tell what we're leading up to, but let's look at some of the data again. First, and in this slide, we see what occurred between the lockdown period and 2 years into the pandemic across every single solution, in part because we were looking for approaches that would maintain patient safety, minimize the risk of transmission of the COVID virus, that would offer a level of convenience and support and also continuity for our trials. So across the board, telemedicine, e-consent, wearable devices, we saw pretty dramatic increases. If I were showing you the reported level of use in the year in between, 2021, it was as high as 90%, 85, 90% for some of these areas, like the use of wearable devices and certainly remote monitoring. So there's been a little bit of a settling down that we have picked up on in terms of the reported level of usage. But here's where it really starts to get quite interesting, or even more interesting. There have been a few studies, one conducted by the Evoca group, another by the Tufts Center, that are really starting to pick up organizational interest in rethinking and reevaluating when and if DCT solutions should be implemented or deployed. In the study by Evoca, which was conducted in 2021, this was among nearly 150 sponsor and CRO companies. In no instance was the projected use of these solutions anywhere close to the level that we were seeing or that was reported in that given year. In our study, we started to really pick up on a couple of key themes that really suggest some of the challenges that companies are now encountering, or that their sites and some of their collaborators are encountering. The difficulties of integrating these solutions into a lot of existing operating activity. A really important area, not having a clear, measurable return on investments that were being made in these deployments. The high observed time that it was taking to start up and initiate and engage all of the parties to support these solutions. A lot of issues with global compliance and variation by country in terms of which solutions were encouraged, which elevated concern. And of course, there were also issues around whether some of the solutions utilized were collecting validated data from the assessments. And lastly, there was growing concern expressed about the readiness of investigative site personnel, as well as even their own staff, to work with some of these solutions that out of necessity we ramped up and adopted far faster than we have typically seen. Now let's look not at the sponsor's observations, but let's look specifically at what the investigative sites had started to communicate. This is now a study that was conducted by WCG, which has its own network of investigative sites, about 3,500. And this was sort of a broad-based survey about a year into the pandemic, and what they heard was an affirmation of some of the themes I'm already mentioning. Some challenges with patient enrollment, using these technologies to really support enrollment given the lack of preparedness that a lot of the sites had. In some of the sites, that was really even manifest in not being able to find staff who were trained to use these technologies. And in the WCG survey, we also saw mention of a study that SCRS, the Society of Clinical Research Sites, had conducted, where 60% of the sites indicated that they had had no prior experience with DCT prior to the pandemic. So a very ill-prepared workforce. Just a few other areas that were echoed: the longer startup time, and of course the perception that when we move to a remote monitoring model, more of the burden, the monitoring burden, is transferred to the site personnel. And that's exactly what we found in a follow-up study done this year. This was more of a qualitative study with focus groups, where we really wanted to get at what are the perceived benefits of these solutions and if they would echo some of the same concerns. The benefits that sites frequently point to is the convenience and the options that are offered their study volunteers. That is really regarded as an incredibly important part of any solution that they would like to be able to support. To be able to offer, even to only a partial group of patients, additional convenience and the ability to participate remotely and to share some of their data using a handheld device, that's an important way that they can offer those choices to their patients. But all of the themes that Avoca pointed to and others really were echoed again in our focus group. Perceived increase in workload, a lot of uncertainty in terms of the challenges of integrating and coordinating the use of all of these different solutions and technologies. Very, very siloed implementation as well, and difficulty coordinating all of these separate and individual parties. And of course, some of the delays that occur when you're now shipping investigational drug or clinical trial supplies directly to a patient's home, and many others. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsey.
Thank you, Ken. So what we have here is the PROMETRIKA pandemic case study, and it really echoes all of the data that Ken just presented. It was our experience, what we just heard about, the site pushback, the site struggles. So at PROMETRIKA, we focus mainly on oncology and rare disease. This is an oncology study. This was a phase 1 oncology study that was really intended to be a traditional study. It was an infusion. The patient needed to come on site. We were looking at safety, so it was very important for the investigator to be part of those safety assessments to protect the patient in this case. It was in the middle of COVID, so just like many of us, all of a sudden one day we were having on-site visits and the next day we were not. So our challenge was really, there was no on-site visits allowed at 4 of this. We had 4 sites, all 4 of them shut down on-site visits. And then of course we had to protect these patients. This is an oncology study, so they're immune compromised. We didn't want them to go on site for many of the visits. We needed them to only go on site for those essential visits. So we had missed and delayed visits, lots of protocol deviations, and the FDA did give us guidance on how to deal with that, so that was good. But we still had to come up with some solutions of our own, or at least try to tackle the problem for our sponsor. So some of our solutions, we implemented remote monitoring, like many others. We created a secure file sharing platform and deployed that right away so we could get those documents from the sites. We did try to do home nursing on this study, and we did try to do decentralized labs, but what we found, we had barriers. So we had site capabilities, they just were not prepared. They didn't have the SOPs, they didn't even have the resources on site to do what they needed to do. And to Ken's point, a lot of times the decentralized approach does put a bit of the burden on the site. It does make it easier for the patient, but we have to consider the site too. They're part of this equation. And then there was, the idea of the technology, reworking our contracts, our budgets, all of those things. So in the end, we were able to complete the study, but it wasn't ideal. And what we really learned from this is that you need to consider DCT during your protocol development. The pandemic, we were forced into doing things, but we learned it's really not ideal to introduce hybrid virtual options in the middle of a trial. It should be fit for purpose at the protocol development stage. And so one of the big things we want you all to walk away with are some things that you can put in your pocket and think, oh, I have a tool now that I can think about when I'm creating my protocol. And a big part of that is risk management. So at PROMETRIKA, every time that we start a project, we look at the protocol and we do a risk analysis. And ideally, you're doing that before you start the study, before you even engage sites, and you're really looking at the protocol, and then you're determining the best fit sites for that protocol that you're trying to run, right? So there's three main areas that we tend to focus on when we're talking about DCT. We have data integrity, and really when we're talking about everything for risk. So we have data integrity, we have patient safety, and regulatory. And the questions that we're asking ourselves directly related to DCT are in the data integrity. If we introduce DCT tools in this protocol, will we put any variability at risk? Are we going to have access to the source that we need to actually verify the quality of the data? Do the sites have the systems that are validated and compliant to allow us to do DCT? If they don't, can we introduce those things for the sites, or is that just we can't go forward with this site or this study in that way? Next, we think about patient safety. So you think about the drug. How is the drug actually going to be administered? Is it something that the patient can self-administer at home? Is it an oral? That's very easy. The patient can do that at home, but if it's an infusion or something that requires an intervention from a physician, you're going to have to think about how can you reliably get that drug into the patient in a safe way and in a compliant way. And then we think about our lab collections. So there's decentralized labs, there's decentralized pharmacies. Those are all options. But if you're looking at like a phase 1 study, you want to make sure the integrity, again, of the data that you're getting, that it's consistent, it's reliable, it's being collected and analyzed in the same way. So at the end of the day, the data that you're going away with is something that you can back. And that's really important. I mean, that's what you're all working towards is your data and that end analysis. And then your assessment compliance. So when you don't have someone coming into the center or at your site, you're losing a bit of control. So is the patient going to actually continue to do all of the things that are required in the protocol? Do you have a way to actually assess if the protocol is being followed or if there are deviations, and is it true? Is it the data that you're getting back to you reliable? And then lastly, we have regulatory. Not always everybody's topic of interest, but it's super important. So we have your informed consent. Is there an ability to do an e-consent? Do the sites have SOPs to do an e-consent? Can we offer that solution to them? We at PROMETRIKA can, but some of the sites that are smaller, if you're working with a small IRB and they require a local IRB, they may not even have the expertise to know how to even tackle an e-consent or introduce an e-consent at their site. Part 11 compliance, all of these systems, you can use decentralized systems and technologies, but they need to be compliant. And then again, I talked about SOPs. So all of these things are tools to think about. When you're talking to your CRO and when you're talking internally, these are the questions to ask yourself early on to determine and let, again, that protocol drive your decisions of if you'll use DCT.
So let's move on to our final section where we're now sort of looking into the future. And we've already guided you through a lot of the considerations that we'd like to suggest for you. So we'll just add a little bit more to that. How should we really be thinking about when and when not to use DCT solutions? And clearly the protocol planning and design period is such an important stage. We'll also share a couple of other thoughts that we'd like to introduce for you to also consider. But just to really frame our thinking, I want to just come back to the exuberance that we have, and some of it is warranted, of course. It is remarkable, as you all know, the unprecedented way that this enterprise has rallied during this global pandemic, and we've really delivered highly safe and effective vaccines and treatments in record time. In fact, the very first vaccines that were introduced into the marketplace came at literally 30% of the average time that it normally takes to develop a vaccine in our industry. And we're now looking at literally thousands of treatments and other vaccines that are in the pipeline specifically just to target COVID. And a lot has happened that has given us pause and has raised the excitement level. Clearly, the rapid deployment, the necessitated deployment of virtual and remote technology is one of the most critical areas, but there are many others, of course. The way that organizations trusted one another and collaborated in a much more effective way. We saw so much more public-private interaction, as well as clinical care and clinical research integration and interaction during the height of the pandemic. And we also saw regulatory agencies and other oversight and governing bodies become more accommodating to permit us to pivot. So a lot of that has now suggested a way forward where we may ultimately see opportunities to streamline and drive efficiency. Will we likely achieve this level of speed for most of the drugs in our pipelines? I think it is highly likely that we will not. And in many cases, perhaps the most important lesson we draw from the pandemic is the way we manage all of these specific approaches simultaneously and synchronously. It's rare that we'll have an opportunity to have all of these align at the same time so that we can mobilize to deliver this level of success. But some of these areas will obviously continue to be important, and we'll get better at it over time. Protocol design is obviously one of the key areas, but we can come back to now the traditional way that we normally adopt an innovation, and this will offer insight into how we need to rethink and reevaluate DCT deployment and use over time. This comes from a study that we conducted about a year ago, where we were just really looking at how long it typically has taken historically to adopt a number of innovations that support clinical trial execution, like interactive voice response technologies, the use of EDC, the use of clinical trial management systems, for example, the use of risk-based quality management approaches. And in a few cases, we have yet to achieve a level of adoption where at least 2/3 of companies conducting and supporting drug development programs or even using them. We still see sponsor companies who would prefer to use paper instead of electronic data capture, even today. So even after 20 years of experience in our industry adopting innovations, we still have yet to see 100% penetration in many cases. The total amount of time that it takes for a single organization to adopt an innovation is on average 6 years, not the 3 months of time that many sponsors had to quickly pivot and embrace the use and deployment of DCT solutions. And here I'm breaking out the stages for you. It takes roughly a little over a year and 2 months, for organizations to even identify and begin to start the process of applying an innovation just on a pilot basis. Then it takes another year to go through some type of pilot experience, and we'll talk about that phase in a minute. Then usually there's a period of time while the pilots are completing, again, a year's worth of time just deciding, just evaluating the information, trying to understand the experience before full implementation even begins, and that takes another 2 years. So that's for a single organization, and when you have early adopters, you have sort of the middle of the road, and then you have the laggards or the late adopters. That's how you get up to that 20-year span for an industry to embrace a technology. One of the main challenges that organizations have is they don't do a good job of gathering data and insight into solutions and their value proposition. What are the benefits that they're offering? What are the true costs? And can we get a return on investment, a quantitative return on investment measure? And that's one of the key areas that we lack today when we look at DCT adoption. We essentially leapfrogged and omitted the evaluation and the adoption decision phase. And so many organizations have taken a step back and are looking at ways to better measure and determine the true value proposition of DCT solutions, the value of offering more options, the value of being able to access data and to automate different activities, to be able to improve access for patients who may not otherwise be able to participate in a study, but to also understand the realities of the use of these technologies and the high cost of using some of them for particular patient communities or for particular study designs. The last area that I want to leave you with is one of the most important ways that we can always be guided in our decisions, and that is by amplifying feedback from patients themselves. And there's a growing body of research that really shows wide variation in patient receptivity to the use of many of these technologies. Generally, when we look at any demographic subgroup, it could be by race and ethnicity, it could be by socioeconomic status, it could be by age, even gender, we see variation. We generally see very high percentages who want to have options. We always see that. But when you start to dig deeper, and here I'm showing you just 4 of the solutions: telemedicine, smartphone applications, the use of wearable devices, and home visits. And we see, for example, that patients who identify within the Asian community are generally less receptive or comfortable to using these technologies than some of the other comparative subgroups. So we do tend to see variation, and I can tell you from looking at the data that it varies dramatically by disease condition as well. I want to lastly just point out some interesting insights that have come out of some of the research with patients. A number of patient communities have a higher likelihood of believing that the use of DCT actually will cost them more out of pocket. So there are some patient communities who can only afford a low volume data plan, and they're afraid that if a DCT is introduced, that might actually be more expensive for them. So just again, some really interesting insights. Another one, we know that certain patient subgroups want more personal interaction, and it's not always age specific. And there is a sense that if it were fully virtual, it would actually take away from or detract from the quality of their relationship with the study staff. So it also helps to even solicit input while the protocol is in draft form from patients to really get their feedback and amplify some of their concerns that are raised based on the solutions that may be deployed to support a given protocol. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Chelsey.
At PROMETRIKA, I mentioned that we focus on oncology and rare disease for the most part. And one area that we really feel is well suited for DCT is rare disease. And I mentioned earlier that rare disease has been here for a very long time, and we can learn a lot from our past and look back, before the pandemic, before we were all forced to do this, and really start to adopt things and see where it's worked well. And in the rare disease community, we have patients that are often very far apart from one another. In some of those rare disease indications, they have a hard time traveling. Their caregivers, they're very dependent on their caregivers, so there's a caregiver burden component that you have to be mindful of. And so in this case study example, we saw where DCT really elevated our ability to make a difference in the study and the impact on the patients, and also get this study done faster. In this, we had the challenge again, the patient proximity to the site, travel burdens, and patient retention. Our solutions, we had EMR to EDC data capture. We were able to directly provide the IP shipments to the patient's homes, and then we had virtual and home visits. And what we found was it substantially decreased the cost of the study. You didn't have to pay for the patients to be traveling and accommodating their stay when they're getting their treatments, which decreased their burden and increased their retention. So this again is just an example where we think, there are definitely studies where we wouldn't say DCT is a great fit for that study, but there are other things that we would say are wonderful fits for DCT, and again, really make it better for the patient, better for the sites, better for the sponsor. Oh, I went backwards, sorry.
I'm happy to give that chart again.
And with that, I'd like to open it up to everyone. If there are questions, I hope that people have come away so far with some good nuggets of information to help you make those strategic decisions in your planning. But does anyone have any questions? We have a microphone.
We'll bring a microphone just because we have some people who are joining us online as well, and they'll be able to hear you.
Sure. Coming through. A lot of discussion on return on investment, primarily kind of questions on the sponsor end of, what is our return on investment in implementing some of these? Just curious on what you're seeing from the data or your experience, like what are some of the ways that a sponsor or really anyone can better measure that? I mean, there's components of just like looking at a budget and that's simple, but then opportunity costs, are you gonna have to like pass up on some sites because they're unwilling to? Just want to hear your thoughts on it.
So first of all, what a timely question, because this is probably the #1 question that we receive daily through email or phone at the center. We've actually published a study where we applied a model to quantify ROI, and I'll be happy to send the paper to you. It's really just an initial attempt because the model, as you can imagine, gets more and more complex the more variables you try to measure. Do we think that DCT might improve screen failure rates or dropout rates, for example? Do we think it will lower the number of amendments or will it increase the number of deviations? Every change that can occur or is impacted by DCT use has a quantifiable impact. And this is something we've started to model. And what we've shown so far is that the overall, but again, we're limited because we only have a few actual examples where we can even look at the true cost of running a DCT-empowered study. In those instances, generally there's a pretty strong ROI for just a few variables, and both in phase 2 and phase 3. And the model is risk adjusted, so it weighs the probability of successfully moving from one phase to another. It looks at operating and technical risk, and all of those things are based on benchmark data. But the key is, again, the model is only as good as the data and the way that we define the variables, and so there's so much more work that needs to be done. We're encouraging companies to look to try to start tracking their own experience, and then if we can aggregate that experience, we'll be able to share sort of a broad industry-wide ROI experience once we sort of reach a sufficient level of data and insight. But it's such an important area that we know organizations are really grappling with right now.
Thank you.
Cassandra's going to get a good amount of exercise running the microphone.
So relative to the risk management slide you had up previously, would there be any special considerations or concerns relative to a hybrid model, but hybrid in the sense that some of the patients are still going to the sites directly, while another subgroup of the patients are actually doing more of the decentralized type approach?
Yeah, I can take that. I think one of the things in risk management that I would highly suggest is you include all your stakeholders. So the way that you're setting that up, that would have impact to how your data is analyzed in the end. So I would really look at your DM team, your biostats team, your SDTM team, and make sure that as you're collecting it, if you're going to be comparing those in any way, that you can compare them with reliability. When it comes to, at the site, if you're talking about, the site might have a subgroup of patients that they decide, you need to be very clear with the site about how that's decided. Will this group be hybrid fully or virtual fully? Will it be hybrid? And what's the eligibility criteria to get into that subgroup to be fully virtual? That's where I would start. And then, again, really reiterating having your stakeholders all have a play in that conversation. Do you have anything to add to that,
Yeah,
Ken?
I just want to add, this is a place where we see in the future probably the group that will most struggle with DCT support is at the site level, because they're going to be managing each trial as a custom experience where 10% of the patients will choose to use all of the DCT options and 20% will only use one, and 40% will want all in-person visits. So this is sort of where we see us going, where it's going to be at such a highly custom level. Sites are going to need to be trained to be so agile that they can manage and coordinate all of these different permutations of offerings over time.
You just made me think of something that I'll add to that as well. Think back to when we had our traditional monitoring and you did 100% SDV, you went on site for everything. And then think about the moment that you told monitors, we're going to do targeted SDV now, or we're going to do risk-based monitoring, and their minds were like, what? You know what I mean? And they needed to be trained. And some of those monitors are no longer monitors because it was really hard for them to keep up with that pace. It's the same idea for the sites. You're completely shifting the way that a site has run clinical trials, so we really need to get down to that level, train them, make sure they have the resources and the support to be able to come along with you on that shift and not get left behind. And some of them may get left behind, truly. I mean, we've had this conversation too as we were prepping for this session, that some sites may not be able to do DCT. And that's okay. They might be great sites for traditional studies. And that's something too when you're thinking about your site selection. You have your protocol all set and finalized. You might have a really favorite site in that indication, but they might not be the best site for this study because they might not be well equipped for it. And that's totally fine. They can still be your favorite site for a different study.
Thank you.
I have a question, and I already have a mic. So, Ken, in one of your slides, you mentioned that one of the concerns from the patient level is around privacy. And so, in your opinion, going to 100% DCT, are there additional privacy concerns around, the DCT model above and beyond how we've been conducting clinical trials today?
So it's a good question. What we've typically seen is that elevated concern about privacy is not specific to the solutions themselves. So we usually see roughly that level even in a traditional trial. And we also see in certain CNS diseases, for example, there's generally more concern about privacy. And so again, it's not tied to the solution per se, but the solution triggers, again, concerns about the data that's being collected, who will have access to it, how will the data be, how will their privacy be protected. So it's clearly a large enough segment that it's a concern that has to be addressed.
And it looks like we also have a question that was submitted from our web audience. So for Ken, did you find a difference in patient comfort level with DCT enabling technology across age groups? interested in your observations, as this is often put forth as a reason for not using technology.
Yeah, and if we had had a lot more time, we could look at a variety of subgroups. But there are age-related differences, and it's not intuitive. That's the interesting thing. We often assume that an older patient community will be less receptive to some of these technologies, and in fact, that's not always the case. A lot of older patients actually like telemedicine, for example, and they're comfortable with it. In fact, I fall in that group, and I'm still just starting to use Facebook, and I know my kids don't use it at all. So clearly, social media has evolves over time depending on what age group you're in. But there are others, like the use of smartphone applications, where we definitely see a little bit of receptivity as a function of how young the patient population might be. What it really comes down to, again, is soliciting input from the patients you're targeting in your enrollment plan as dictated by the protocol, and really finding and soliciting input into the design of the protocol before it's finalized, so that you can anticipate some of the differences that you might encounter in terms of their comfort level and receptivity with choices you've made about solutions to offer.
I think we had a question over here.
Chelsey, at the beginning you stated that DCT has been around for a long time, and my question is, are there any DCT methodologies that maybe the pharma industry has not thought about, like leveraging, applications, leveraging the technologies that are out there to, maybe bring those in and maybe improve things?
Put me on the spot here. Are there any that you're saying that the pharmaceutical industry has not thought about?
Or maybe let me ask it this way. Is
Okay.
there a few things that you just wish could if we had these things, we could make DCT better?
There's many things that I wish that we had in clinical research. I think Ken talks about them a lot. Sharing of data and sharing of insights across the board is a huge one. I think it's hard for me to think of a technology that we haven't. Do you have an example of one that comes to mind?
If I did, I'd be investing in.
That's what I'm thinking.
I think a quick answer to that is often just doing a quick search of all of the tiny startup companies that are looking at areas where there is tension or where there's a high level of inefficiency. They're always emerging. I think if you go to a DIA annual meeting and walk around the exhibit hall, you'll see easily 10 companies that you've never seen before. Or DPharm is another conference where you sort of attract a lot of really early stage companies. But to your point, Chelsey, there are so many places where we talk about the technology availability, and yet if you dig deeper, you realize it's not anywhere near what it promises to offer, including the challenge we have in aggregating electronic health records. The typical patient has 4 or 5 disparate records and we can't combine them. Wouldn't it be amazing if we could just do that? Or as Chelsey was mentioning, about 85% of patients in trials never find out the results of their own study. That seems to be addressable now, and there are even regulations in the EU that require all sponsors to provide results in plain language, but it's not being enforced, and it's not happening right now. And we certainly don't have that level of regulatory encouragement in the US. So that's another area where we would love to see some type of electronic platform or way of communicating even general results without even disclosing the patient's own sort of personalized experience in a trial.
And failure results too. So I mean, collectively as a community, we're all working towards those goals to find, so we don't want to be going down rabbit holes that are going to lead nowhere if someone else in a peer has already tried that approach. One other thing I'll add that, I do think about is if you think about like your personalized care as a patient, we've started to see more decentralized approaches. Like Ken was saying, he has telemedicine, and you have access to your medical records at home now. And I think the more, I don't necessarily think the technology and the absence of technology is our problem. I think it's thinking about how that technology works and weaves into the everyday life of a patient. And if we can think about that more, so it's not hard to adopt, that I think is the harder part than getting the technology itself. It doesn't need to be new and shiny. It can be something super simple like your smartwatch. But if it's something that you're doing in your day-to-day, like actually wearing your smartwatch, then that's more beneficial in the long run for us.
Thank you both.
Yeah, thanks. All right. Are there any other questions? Any more from the web, Kathy?
Yeah, I think we have time for one more. This is a question for Ken. Interested in your thoughts on the recent announcements from retail pharmacies and big box stores like Walmart. Do you think they'll be successful as physical hubs to facilitate hybrid trials?
Oh my goodness, is everybody ready to be here for a while? It's really quite a fascinating development where pharmacy chains are now looking to become local hubs, perhaps in partnership with local investigative sites as well. But it's really, what interests us is that it is another option. Pharmacies tend to be places where patients actually do trust the health information that they receive there. And for many people, a pharmacy is one of the only places where they can access health-related information in addition to prescriptions and other health-related products. So it has a lot of potential as a potential area that might offer the opportunity to participate in a trial, particularly in some of those more remote communities. The challenge of integrating it into this incredible fragmented mosaic of approaches that we use, I think will be a real challenge for a lot of these organizations like CVS and Walgreens. But we've been hearing a lot of very promising updates on steps that they're taking to really try to become part of this fabric and not try to rewrite it or change it. So that's something we're monitoring and hope that we'll be able to share some sort of high-level insight with data as to what kind of penetration and usage they're receiving as they start participating within clinical research as well.
Great. I think that wraps it up for us. I want to thank everyone so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and join us for this event. I've personally really enjoyed it. I have totally enjoyed spending so much time with Ken Getz, and I want to thank Miganush and our PROMETRIKA team for putting on such a great event. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. I'm sure that Ken would love to answer any questions that you may have. I am definitely available, and we look forward to hopefully talking with you soon and wish you the best in your drug development goals. Thank you so much. Take care.